Welcome to 2020, everybody. When I was a young kid growing up in the 60s and 1970s, the actual idea of 2020 was just such a bizarre concept that you wouldn't even think about. You know, we are living in the future. And of course, if the recent events of what 2020 is bringing to us, it's certainly going to be a very, very fascinating year. Now, I'm delighted to announce that we already have guests for every single episode, all 12 episodes this year. We've already got guests available, and I posted something on my website to say who the guests are, and we've got some fascinating people this year. Also, Dia, my producer, and I were just discussing now that we're probably going to have to do other shows to fill in, because I have backstop of guests and returning guests that we'd like to interview as well. The first person I'm interviewing for this year is somebody that I've been wanting to talk to for a long time, because his work intrigues me and fascinates me, and it particularly ties in with the themes of my latest book, The Hidden Universe. Now, just to tell you a little bit about the guest, a gentleman called Dr. Neil Rushton. And Dr. Neil received his doctorate in archaeology and history from Trinity College, University of Cambridge in 2002. He investigated the role of the English monasteries in the provision of poor relief during the later Middle Ages. He worked as an archaeologist through till late 2015, when a visual impairment halted his career. Since this time, he has concentrated on research into British folklore, most specifically folklore involving the entities usually known as the faeries. Now, interesting as an aside here, Neil lives on the Wirral near Liverpool, which is the area I was brought up in, and we were just discussing beforehand that people from that area, however long we live away, we have certain ways of saying things that, however well you train yourself, you cannot change. And one of them is using the word fairy, because we actually sound as if you're talking about some kind of creature that's covered in fur rather than the little creatures. Now, you will notice that Neil, because he is not from that area, will pronounce fairies fairy or something like that, which is more like ferry, which is subtly different. But just going back to Neil again, he has published articles on the subject for a range of magazines and websites, including New Dawn magazine, The Daily Grail, SOT, Ancient Origins, and Beyond Science. His blog site investigates the fairies from a range of perspectives and now contains about 50 articles. And do check this website out, guys, because it's got some fascinating articles in there. And this is https://deadbutdreaming.wordpress.com. We'll actually mention this towards the end as well. Also, it's fascinating, his first novel, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, was published in 2016, and his second, Dead But Dreaming, is due for publication in the spring of this year. Neil lives in Wallasey on the Wirral. Now, I very much got the hints of Neil's novel here of self-controls, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, because it's a title of a Pink Floyd track. And I suspect that this novel has elements of whatever happened to Syd Barrett, who was, funnily enough, somebody we were only talking about recently in one of my group meetings. So without further ado, Neil, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on board.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here.
Good. And how's the weather on the Wirral today?
Awful.
It always is.
It's been awful for about 4 months, so there's no change there.
It always is. It's a bit like Everton as well, isn't it?
Oh, don't go there. Don't go there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're both Everton supporters. My first team is Tranmere Rovers, but we're also Everton supporters, so we were commiserating before about things, that things might be getting better. Right, okay. We've done a little bit of a brief introduction. So what I'd like to do now is to go straight into the meat of the interview, really. And of course, it's talking about the Fae, it's talking about the hidden Commonwealth, it's talking about entities that we perceive in altered states of consciousness all around us. So in terms of yourself, I mean, when did your interest in fairy folklore begin and why?
Okay, well, like you say, I got my PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2002, but I've actually been an archaeologist, trained as an archaeologist since 1992. And the PhD and most of my work in archaeology has kind of, it's kind of materialistic. It's just straightforward, straight down the line archaeology with some history thrown in. But soon after I started working as an archaeologist, I became interested in how other disciplines can be linked in to what we're doing as archaeologists. Most specifically for me, it was folklore, and it began, I don't know, some point in the 90s, late 90s, with this book here by a chap called Leslie Grinsell, and it's called The Folklore of Prehistoric Sites in Britain. And what he did was to link prehistoric, obviously archaeological prehistoric sites, and the folklore that was associated with them. And a lot of that book talks about how the faeries have interacted throughout history, specifically at these sites, and that really got my interest. And as soon as I read that, I have always attempted to integrate the folklore of these sites. I mean, that's prehistoric sites, the post historic sites as well, which have fairy connotations. So really interested in that. And slightly more unlikely, soon after reading that, I saw and read this book.
Oh, yes.
A classic book by Brian Froud and Alan Lee, the illustrators. I don't know where you can, I'm not going to show you the pictures. People are probably aware of it. And they wrote that book in 1978, and it was based on the folklorist's Catherine Briggs' encyclopedia of fairies. Her descriptions were turned into folkloric fairies. And there's something authentic about this book and the illustrations of Froud and Alan Lee. Alan Lee actually worked on the Lord of the Rings cycle with Peter Jackson doing a lot of the illustrations. It just got to me, and I thought, this is where the folklore can be taken into something that I can understand. And as we'll talk about a bit later, the kind of fairies depicted by Froud and Lee there, they have an authenticity about it. And well, we can talk about that a little bit later, maybe. And I do have to apologise to viewers that, I do have visual impairment, as you say. So if you see my eyes flickering around, it is a little bit embarrassing for me. But if you can bear with me,
of course,
I'll do my best. So when my APCH failed in 2015, I had to leave work my work as an archaeologist, and I decided to throw myself into, I guess, an investigation of the fairies, starting the blog site, which you kindly mentioned, and attempting to just bring something new to an understanding of what they really are. Now, while this has to include a deep reading of the folklore, you've got to know the folklore. You can't just look at Brian Froud's fairies and think everything about the fairies. You've got to have a deep reading of it. And I was never just wanting to investigate them from a position of, cultural imperialism, where a folklorist might collect and interpret the stories, but always have the implicit assumption that they were, simply fossilized parts of a belief system from past times. I've come to think of the fairies as much more dynamic phenomenon, partly through my own direct experiences, which I hope we can talk about. And partly through the continuing number of experience by people reported all over the world. So some of these people will be mystics, clairvoyants, theosophists, etc. But many people have fairy experiences out of the blue and find them difficult to correlate with their usual version of consensus reality. So I guess it's a nuanced phenomenon, one that certainly since I started writing about it in 2016 has begun to attract more and more attention from a range of researchers, not just folklorists, but a range of esoteric writers. So that's where I am now, and I wouldn't say I've swapped from being an archaeologist to a folklorist, and I've certainly never collected a folklore story in my life. So I can't call myself a folklorist, but this is where my future interests lay, I think.
Okay, because one of the things that I was very intrigued with when I was doing research for my book, The Hidden Universe, I was very intrigued as to how, over time, the way in which the overall phenomenon of fairy encounters and fae encounters seemed to be fairly consistent. And then suddenly it started to change around about the 19th to 20th century, when suddenly there was a nuanced change in terms of the whole thing and the way people were perceiving them. What's your opinions on that? Can you tell us a little bit about how this has developed over the centuries and where it's moved to?
Yeah. Well, someone like Graham Hancock, who I'm a great fan of Graham Hancock and his work, in his 2005 book, Supernatural, he suggested that prehistoric Paleolithic cave paintings were perhaps, I think he used the term, the earliest folklore. And so if you really want to stretch it back, you can go back to the Paleolithic period, where some of these cave paintings are uncannily, some of the depictions in the cave paintings are uncannily like the fairies from the Middle Ages and the early modern period right up to today. So if you want to, that's quite a stretch. Some people won't have that, but I think there's a lot of credence to what he's saying in that interpretation of where the fairies may have come from. And of course, if we take that at face value, then throughout human history. But if we move on to like more recognizable fairies in literature from, say, from the classical world, that's probably where you get the first instances of supernatural entities such as dryads and nymphs in ancient Greece and Rome. But what we might recognize as, I guess, true fairy motifs and types from the Middle Ages. And so the most obvious place to go in the first place is the Arthurian cycle of stories, which came to be known as the Matter of Britain from the 12th century to the 15th century. People like Chrétien de Troyes and Thomas Malory writing about the Matter of Britain, Arthurian cycle, and there are lots of fairies in these stories. They tend to be a sort of distinctive breed. I'm thinking of characters like Morgan Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake. So they're ontologically different from the entities that most often surface in contemporary and later vernacular folklore, which I'll talk about. But the Arthurian fairies usually have a specific role to fill, catering to the literate classes, the aristocracy who were consuming the stories. But the genesis of the fairies in the Arthurian landscape is also deeply rooted in a folk belief system developed from a Celtic oral tradition, which informs many of the motifs in the legend. I'm thinking of story cycles like the Welsh Mabinogion, which didn't appear in written form till 14th century, but which seems to have been doing the rounds as an oral tradition since the 10th century. But while this was happening in aristocratic households, listening to stories about the Arthurian cycle, there was more vernacular folklore of the fairies, which is probably best represented by some of the medieval chroniclers from the 12th and 13th century. I'm thinking of Walter Map, Gervase of Tilbury, Ralph de Coggeshall, William de Newburgh. Although they were primarily recording historic events in their chronicles, they would often divert into what they would call marvels, many of which involved anecdotes about the fairies as we recognise them today. And it's interesting that these chroniclers were educated men, obviously Christian, but they seemed happy to relate the fairy anecdotes as real events, even though the fairies sat quite uncomfortably with a Christian cosmology. The fairies were kind of epistemological outriders. So, for instance, we get folklore about in these chronicles. We get folklore about people being drawn into hollow hills and interacting with fairies that were humanoid but not quite human. And some common motifs appear in these texts for the first time, such as fairyland operating under a different system of time, where an hour dancing with the fairies in a ring might translate to a year or longer when the human escapes the dance. That's actually one of the most common motifs in structured narrative folklore, and the more anecdotal accounts in the Middle Ages through to the 19th century and even beyond. But it's coming out of the medieval period is when we really get to see the fairies, and one route into this is through the witch trials. The record of the early modern witch trials, mostly from the 16th and 17th century, there are some earlier, where the witches on trial rather ill-advisedly would be talking about their familiars. Often these would take the shape of sometimes animals, but as often as not, they would be what we would recognize as fairies, helping them travel to other worlds, often after taking certain substances to alter their state of consciousness. And and doing so with a familiar. This usually worked out badly for them in these courts. But the records, they give us a great insight into this. And I think probably the best writer on this that I've read is someone called Emma Wilby. And she was talking, she talks about the witches, she calls it the Shamanistic Hypotheses, where the witches were carrying on a pre-medieval shamanistic tradition in Europe, under the radar kind of thing. But there are other ways we can get to these early modern fairies. One of my favourites is the Reverend Robert Kirk's The Secret Commonwealth, which you've written about in your new book. This was written in 1691, not actually published until the 19th century. But he describes, he was in a place called Aberfoyle in Scotland, and he describes people around him with the second sight, clairvoyance, whatever you want to call it. And they were the ones who were interacting with the fairies. And as we'll talk about a bit later on, it's very interesting that there's very little materiality to this. These beings were non-physical beings that people with a second sight were able to see and interact with at some level. So there are lots of other sources from the early modern period, but those are two, just to give you an idea of where we're getting this information about the fairies at this time. But it's not until the 19th century and early 20th century that folklorists go out and systematically collect the material that has been there as an oral tradition for centuries, probably from the medieval period. Perhaps my favourite of the, I could list off all these folklorists, but just to focus in on one, is called W.Y. Evans Vence, who I know you're familiar with. And in 1911, he published The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, where he'd travelled around Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, Brittany, and collected the testimonies of the people. And it's a dynamic book. If anyone wants to get into what the folklore says about the fairies, I'd recommend it as a starting point. It's a very easy reader, and it really does bring out some of what was probably going on in these rural communities and what their belief in the fairies were. But whilst all this is going on, the 19th and 20th century, and I know this is a long way to get to your original question of 19th and what was happening in the 19th, 20th century. There was also a new artistic representation of the fairies. Now I'm thinking of artists such as John Anster Fitzgerald, John Atkinson Grimshaw, and Richard Doyle, lots of them. And they began to give visual images of the fairies. And this Victorian disposition tended to be to render them with wings, sylph-like, more in tune with an idea of nature spirits. I'll talk a little bit later about a 16th century guy called alchemist called Paracelsus, who initiated this idea of nature spirits. And some of those nature spirits were aerial. That translated into this artwork in the 19th century as what we would start to recognize as winged fairies. And probably the crucial moment was in 1911 when J.M. Barrie published Peter and Mary, Peter Pan, and introduced the character Tinkerbell, who most people will think of as a typical fairy. And from that point on, that's probably what most people would, through the 20th century, thought of as a typical fairy. So there are sort of streams of cultural ideas about the fairies here. You know, you can go back to the cave paintings, the classical tropes, the structured narrative fairy stories, the anecdotal folklore of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, but also an amalgamated idea of nature spirits with the folklore, giving rise ultimately to, you know, that Tinkerbell-like fairy. And as I say, if you ask, until through the 20th century, to the later part of it, if you ask most people what they thought a fairy was, they most likely describe a winged Tinkerbell type. But I think this is beginning to change, most especially since the advent of the internet, I guess, and more widespread availability of anecdotal entity experiences. So this modern data usually has a different tone to it than the folklore collected in the past, most especially as it tends to be personal, direct experience, rather than what the tendency in the past was to talk about events and experience that happened to previous generations. That's how the folklore tends to work. So, you know, if you want to go on to some themes about modern fairy encounters now, is this a good time?
Yeah, one of the things that clearly, because, you know, my own personal interest in this is the implications for this for such phenomena as alien abduction, DMT encounters, Terence McKenna and machine elves, these kind of things. So how does that work within this? Are they actually archetypes, or is there something more going on here? Because it would be useful to just talk for a few minutes about how it has changed in the last 50 or 60 years. And what this may be telling us?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'll come specifically to those issues of altered states of consciousness. But if you can just allow me just to give you an idea of what might be going on,
please,
in late 20th, 21st century, because I think a really good place to start is a census or a survey carried out by something called the Fairy Investigation Society. There is such a thing. It's run by a chap called Simon Young, an academic. And in 2017, the census went out, and when it was published, there are over 500 testimonies of people claiming to have encounters with fairies. So these are all anecdotal, first-person accounts, and most of them date from the 21st century, but some do date back to the 1960s. So as with any anecdotal account of any experience, allowances need to be made for, how would you say, false or distorted memories, exaggerations in the testimony, you know, that kind of thing. But they are fascinating. And while some of them do describe Tinkerbell types, the majority seem to conform to folkloric types or more amorphous nature spirits. So if I can give you just one example from the census, just to give you an idea of the type of testimony, just if you just bear me while I read this out and refocus my eyes. So this is from Somerset, England, and was described by a female in her 20s. The experience happened in the 1990s. Friends had gone ahead and I straggled behind. As I turned a corner, it was misty. The mist had a weird glow. As I walked into the low mist, there was a procession. There were a group of entities about 3 feet tall, humanoid, with lanterns. But in the mist, I paused and they saw me. They came forward and I waited for them to pass. They passed. I have never taken drugs and was not on any alcohol. This was the weirdest experience. It lasted 3 to 5 minutes. By the time I got back to my cottage, my friends were concerned as I was away for about 45 minutes. Very strange. They looked medieval in dress, but their clothes were covered in mist at times. So that's kind of typical of the type of report that you're getting in this census. The respondents also reported that there was a profound silence before the experience, and their hair was prickling and tingling during the event. She also suggested that the experience marked a turning point in her life. That's another theme of the census that you get. So it's anecdotal in nature, usually visual and audio. There's no tactile experiences, and most of them are reported by people who have not had any other similar experiences. There seem people making the testimony seem, without exception, to be quite ordinary people living, you know, normal lives who have had an extraordinary experience involving fairy type entities. So although I would suggest as we can talk about in a minute, that these people are most often undergoing like a subtle alteration in their usual conscious state before their experiences. There's often description in these testimonies of feeling more than usually happy or depressed or tired or emotional before the incidents. I think this is quite important. And this census is just an example of modern sightings I'm using. A scan of some of the more, esoteric parts of the internet reveal that fairy encounters are perhaps more common than believed. But if we take this one step further, we can start to include encounter fairy types, encounters with, fairy type entities, both by people who have taken an entheogenic, psychedelic, and perhaps more controversially, as you've just pointed out, people who believe they've been involved in the alien abduction phenomenon. In terms of entity contact or experience after taking an entheogen or psychedelic, my recommendation would be to go to a survey by a chap called John Hanna. I actually included it. It's in one of the blog sites, one of my blog posts, where it's a long survey, and basically what he does is take testimonies from the website called Erowid, which I'm sure you know about. And he has surveyed all of the examples from, Erowid, for viewers who don't know, is a website where people can give testimony after they've taken usually a psychedelic drug, or all sorts of drugs are included. Thousands, tens of thousands of testimonies. And in his survey, he found that, this is an estimate, but there's around about 30% of entities experienced on psychedelics that could be described as fairy type entities. And maybe we can just come back to this as we go on, but I'm just pointing out this survey by John Hanna. There have been others since, but I think this is a good starting point for people to understand that these people have altered their states of consciousness on purpose, and many of them who describe entity contact will describe them as fairies or elves or any of the other sort of terms that can be used. If we want to move on to the alien abduction phenomenon.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, that'll be good. Because one of the things immediately when you were describing the kind of the strange state of consciousness that people get in, the idea of kind of either a feeling of buzzing or a feeling of dislocation. And I'm reminded here of Jenny Randall's concept of the Oz factor. And again, for people who don't know, Jenny Randall's is a UFO researcher and everything else, actually again based in the Wirral area, and she's collected some fascinating data in terms of that, which I'm sure you're aware of. But yes, I would like to move on now to the alien abduction concept, and then moving on from there into the idea of exactly what you think these entities are. Are they physical? Are they non-physical? And what do they tell us about the greater reality that we exist within?
Yeah. Well, first off, while I remember that it's at my side, this is probably
the book,
the original primer to understanding how the alien abduction phenomenon may be related to incidents of fairy contact. So sorry, I'm showing you the book, not talking about it. It's Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, which was first published in 1969, I believe, 68, 69.
Yeah.
And it was the first book to really talk about what was then quite a new phenomenon, the alien abduction phenomenon. I mean, since 1969, there's been an exponential growth in numbers of reported cases, probably hundreds of thousands. And he sets his stall out pretty clear that he thinks the aliens involved in modern day abduction cases are exactly the same as the fairies. It's something that Graham Hancock has taken on. And there's a recent book published last year by a chap called Joshua Cutchin, talking about this exact same thing. But if I can, again, just read a short quote from Jacques Vallée, just to give viewers who are unfamiliar with the work an idea of exactly what he thinks. He says, "The modern global belief in flying saucers and their occupants is identical to an earlier belief in the fairy faith. The entities described as the pilots of the craft are indistinguishable from the elves, sylphs, and lutins of the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Through the observations of unidentified flying objects, we are concerned with an agency our ancestors knew well and regarded with terror. We are prying into the affairs of the secret Commonwealth." And of course, there he's referring to the Robert Kirk book from the 17th century. So I guess, whatever your views on this, and I do realise probably not so many of the viewers of your podcast, Anthony, but I do realise there are many who will simply say this is just mumbo jumbo, propagated by people either off their head on drugs or deeply deluded and mentally ill. but I see in the data how do I say, a level of consistency. And when I see this, I think testimonies need to be taken seriously, at least considered with an open mind. I guess once you've taken in all the data and filtered out as much noise as possible, the most obvious question to ask is, as you have just done, what are the fairies in whatever form? What are these entities people seem to have been encountering for a very long time in a relatively consistent way, even if you don't agree entirely with Jacques Vallée's very, black and white statement. Well, what are the fairies? Can I go back for a moment to the Census Area Investigation Society? So the contributors giving the testimony were asked on a standardised form what they thought the entities they experienced were. Only a little over half, I think, answered this question. But of those who did, the majority said they thought they were nature spirits or interdimensional beings. There was a general sort of recognition that these were non-material entities that somehow manifested within our material reality. And again, in John Hanna's survey, which I've just talked about, people experience non-human intelligences. There was also a consensus view that these entities were real, but they had no material form. They tend to be visual and audio phenomena. Rarely is there any physical contact or physical residue. Now, in the historic folklore, this isn't always the case. In the more anecdotal accounts, I guess fairies do often, adhere to modern accounts. People see something, maybe interact with them, but they remain rather, how do I say, amorphous. But in the folklore, which has been turned into more of a story with a narrative over time, fairies can appear to have, they've come into our material world and adhere to the laws of physics. There's plenty of folklore about fairies marrying humans, for instance, even having children. But I think this is just a narrative, a narrative overlay, something to make a good story out of a more indefinite experience. If we take all the anecdotal folklore and all the anecdotal modern testimony, all stripping out the fairy tales and narrative folklore, we're left with a very non-physical phenomenon. Fairies appear to be either operating within human consciousness, probably at a collective level, as we can talk about in a minute, or they're from a different level of reality. So I think asking what the fairies is an unanswerable question ultimately, but perhaps asking how they are experienced might shed some light on what they might be and what they might mean to us.
Okay, so moving on to that, so how do you think they are experienced? What is the mechanisms here taking place?
Ultimately, I think they are experienced through subtle or dramatic altered states of consciousness. Now, if I can just pick out 3 examples of what I'm talking about, I hope it's not going to take up too much time, but I think
it's fine. It's fascinating. Keep going.
This is the most important part of our conversation, I think. So if I give you one example from the folklore, very, very, very unusual account from the folklore, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Rudolf Steiner and the Theosophists movement. There's a word I can never say. Theosophists movement of the early 20th century, and then briefly come back to changing our state of consciousness deliberately through psychedelics. So the story of the folklore story I want to talk about is Anne Jeffreys. It's very unusual and it's so well documented, and it has the air of authority about it. There are lots of nuances to the story, and anyone interested in following it up, there's a detailed description on my website and one of the posts. But I'll try very briefly to summarise what the story is about. Anne was Anne went into domestic service with a wealthy family called the Pitt family at their estate in St Teith in Cornwall in 1645. The story is contained in a series of contemporary letters which were consolidated in the 19th century by a folklorist called Robert Hunt. Now, there are a lot of interesting facets to Anne's story, but the one I want to highlight is her trip to fairyland. It really is a trip. Basically, she was in the garden of the manor house one day when she felt dizzy and suddenly found herself in the presence of a group of diminutive humanoids. And again, if you allow me to drop briefly, quote directly from the story, because I think it's just important to get a handle on this into what, especially as to what we're going to talk about in a moment. So the story runs, one of them, the diminutive figures, ran his fingers over her eyes, and she felt as if they had been pricked with a pin. Suddenly Anne became blind, and she felt herself whirled through the air at a great rate. By and by, one of her little companions said something which sounded like, "Tear away," and lo, Anne had her sight at once restored. She was in one of the most beautiful places, temples and palaces, gold and silver, trees laden with fruit and flower, lakes full of gold, silver fish, the air full of birds and sweetest song and more brilliant colours. Hundreds of ladies and gentlemen were walking about. Hundreds more were idling in the most luxurious bowers, the fragrance of the flowers oppressing them with sense of delicious repose. Hundreds were also dancing, engaged in sports of various kinds. Anne was, however, surprised to find that these people were no longer the small people she had previously seen. There was now no more than the difference usually seen in a crowd between their height and their own. And her own. So Anne stays there for a while until there's a disagreement with some of the fairies, and suddenly she finds herself coming back into the garden, back in the garden, surrounded by the family, the Pitt family. She'd had some sort of fit, and she'd passed out. So now, interestingly, she'd been known for what was termed convulsion fits or distemper. She was also reported as saying, "You know that my sickness and fits comes very suddenly upon me." Now, these seizures sound to me like epilepsy. I don't know whether you'd agree with that.
Oh, totally. Very quickly here, I would suggest, if anybody listening to this, I've interviewed on a couple of occasions now a gentleman called Myron Dial on this show. And Myron experiences temporal lobe epilepsy. And when you were describing the Anne Jeffreys case, which I'm very aware of the Anne Jeffreys case, immediately it was resonating with me to say this is very similar to Myron's experiences with Zelcom. So yeah, it's absolutely the classic of what I consider opening the doors of perception here. The doors are opening and alternate realities are being perceived.
Well, I'm in total agreement with you. You know, temporal lobe epilepsy there's a variety of transcendent mystical experience, including the alien abduction phenomenon, as you know. A writer called Clifford Pickover.
Clifford, yeah, I know Clifford.
So he summarizes these experiences. Sorry, very short quote. He says, people with frequent bursts of electrical activity in their temporal lobes report sensations of flying, floating, leaving the body, as well as other mystical experiences. So, you know, the onset of an epileptic episode often includes a tingling or prickling in the eyes, loss of vision, as reported by Anne after the fairies crawl into her garden. So here's an example from folkloric record of someone experienced non-human intelligent entities in a very realistic way, while her body was evidently in a catatonic state. If we can at least, you know, consider the possibility that this state of consciousness was caused by temporal lobe epilepsy, we can see someone having a real experience in a subjective way by her consciousness being altered. There was no physical reality to a situation, but her consciousness was able to involve itself in an intensely real experience.
Of course, there are elements here, aren't there, when you think about this as well? You know, it's like the classic out-of-body experience. It can be paralleled with the near-death experience. There's many similar overlaps of these phenomena, but I just thought I'd interject there for a second. But please go on. I don't stop you flow.
Well, you know, so there's my example from the folklore record. It is a very, as I say, it's very well documented. That's what makes it a little bit special. You know, it's a good one. So if we move on to my second example, the Theosophist movement, which was active, I can't remember the name of the date when the movement was founded, but it was late 19th century and most active in the early 20th century. Now, one of the most important propagators of the theosophical ideas was a chap called Rudolf Steiner, who I'm sure viewers will be aware of. So he was active in the first few decades of the 20th century, and one of his main contentions was that we can contact and interact with non-human entities by way of clairvoyance, much in the same way as Robert Kirk was talking about people with the second sight in 17th century Scotland. So he took his lead from someone who I've already mentioned, the alchemist Paracelsus from the 16th century, who first termed these entities nature spirits. So you've got the sylph of the air, the undine of the water, the gnome of the earth, and the salamanders of fire. Steiner took this and worked with it. And I know we haven't got time to get in a conversation of, you know, are the nature spirits fairies? But I think it's reasonable if we allow broad, how do you say, epistemological remit to non-human intelligence. I think we can allow that what both of these people were talking about were fairy-like entities. So Steiner usually termed them elementals, living in an elemental world. And for him, clairvoyance was the crossover technique to contact them and put yourself in their world. It's sort of meditation to alter your consciousness, if you like. He thought all humans have the ability to attain this, but for whatever reasons, many of us have lost. So again, sorry to be quoting people at you
Fine.
at their intervals, but it's important. I don't want to mangle their quotes, and they say a massive amount of exactly what we're talking about. So in one of his essays about nature spirits from 1911, he says this about how to gain access to the elemental world. A person must transform their usually passive thought forms into something more dynamic. In normal consciousness, thoughts allow themselves to be connected and separated, to be formed and then dismissed. This life of thought must develop in the elemental world a step further. There, a person is not in a position to deal with thoughts that are passive. If someone really succeeds in entering the world with his clairvoyant soul, it seems as though his thoughts were not things over which he has any command. They are living beings, the thoughts. You thrust your consciousness into a place, it seems, where you do not find thoughts that are like those in the physical world, but where they are living beings. This is, I think that's a profound statement by Steiner. He seems to be suggesting that if we learn how to alter our state of consciousness from its usual passive state, we can unveil a reality that exists alongside us, where we might find, an ulterior form of intelligence. And which we might call fairies or nature spirits or elementals. And there are certainly many people in history and modern world who claim this is perfectly possible. You don't need to be an adherent of theosophy. Which takes us to my third example. I hope we're not running out of time.
No, we're fine. We've still got 15 minutes.
Right. So, and this is a special thing for me. In what it says about the fairies and non-human intelligences. And it's about people who've purposely consumed entheogenic psychedelic compounds. So we've talked about the survey by John Hanna, but there's a burgeoning amount of material on the internet, which you know about, Anthony, and in publication about people who've taken a psychedelic and experienced non-human intelligence, some of which we could call fairy-type entities. Now, exclusively, there's no question of any of these people having the experience in the physical world. Their physical bodies are prone during the experience, but what their consciousness experiences is super real. You know, for anyone who hasn't taken a high dose psychedelic, it's difficult to comprehend. They'll be liable just to write it all off as a hallucination with no real component. One of my favorite studies is Dr. Rick Strassman's study. You know, it's the classic study of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is sort of the royalty of psychedelics, as I believe Terence McKenna calls it. And this was a 1995 study with about 50 people who were given high dose DMT and basically went into other worlds in a very, very super real, cogent way. And their experiences of that consciousness experience were put into the book, which I forget the name of.
DMT, the spirit molecule.
Spirit molecule, exactly. Fantastic book. And a lot of these entities were fairy-like. I'd say about 50% could be classed as possible fairies. So there you go. You're undergoing an altered state of consciousness. You're not leaving the bed. You know, they were in the hospital bed in New Mexico. No doubt about that. Where did their consciousness go, and what did they experience when they had this super real? Without exception, when they came back from these experiences, these people, it was more real than this. There was no way this was an hallucination or a dream. It's something else. And here, sure enough, they experienced the entities. So I think a useful way of, you know, what were they then? What were these people experiences? Going back to Anne Jeffries, the Theosophists, these DMT studies, people in John Hanna's survey, they're altering their state of consciousness, they're experiencing something else. And I always go back to a favourite author of mine, David Luke, who I know you know, who he investigates non-human intelligence, mostly after psychedelic use, but not always. And he has a 3-part interpretation for what this might mean when a person alters the state of consciousness and experiences these entities. So let me just read out his excellent 3-part interpretation. 1, they're hallucinations. The entities are subjective hallucinations. Such a position is favoured by those taking a purely materialist, reductionist, neuropsychological approach to the phenomenon. 2, they are psychological transpersonal manifestations. The communicating entities appear alien, but are actually unfamiliar aspects of ourselves, be they our reptilian brain or our cells, molecules, or subatomic particles. Or 3, the entities exist in other worlds that can interface with our physical reality. A numinous experience provides access to a true alternate dimension inhabited by independently existing intelligent entities in a standalone reality, which exists collaterally with ours and may interact with our world when certain conditions are met. The identity of the entities remains speculative. I think that's a very useful way of looking at this issue and trying to come to, as he points out, if you're a materialist, a reductionist, it's a load of mumbo jumbo. You're just having an hallucination, and it's as simple as that, because consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. Well, I don't believe a word of that, because as I hope we can finish off with, I've had my own experiences from a variety of ways, which, as always, direct experience of these things is the only way you're really going to get to it.
Well, you're going to be interested. It'd be interesting to know, actually, that I don't know if you were, but there is research going on at the moment at Imperial College in London, I think, financed by Anton Bilton, the multimillionaire. And I know that David Luke is involved in it as well. And in fact, the future guest of this program, Dr. Carl Smith, is somebody who is directly one of the people taking DMT and reporting back the entities that he's actually coming into contact with. So to me, this seems to be very much, although it is profoundly subjective in its experience, doesn't necessarily mean because it's not subjective, it's not true. in the final analysis, everything is subjective, as we know. And as you know from, and I'm really pleased to know that you've managed to read my new book, The Hidden Universe, because as you know, I take this thing about egregorials. And thank you very much.
A little ad for you.
Thank you. And I was fascinated about your Steiner quote in terms of the concept that these creatures in some way are created by our minds, are brought into existence, but they have independent existence of us. But what I'd like to do is to move on now, because you've just intimated about your own experiences with these entities. And I'm always fascinated by people's subjective experiences. So can you tell us a little bit about your experiences and what message you felt, what it told you about the nature of reality?
That's a big question, actually.
It is indeed. And you have approximately 8 minutes to do it.
Right. Well, you know, I do understand that anyone talking about interacting with the fairies might simply be deemed insane. That's kind of why I resisted for such a long time about talking about it before I started the blog site. But I guess my own experience is threefold. The first time the first time I experienced a fairy was when I meditated in West Kennet Longbarrow in the late 1990s with a friend. And now I may have been predisposed to this, but the fairy entity, which I guess you could say I was in a hypnagogic state, on the edge of sleep, hadn't taken any drugs, was just meditating, and basically a fairy came out of the wall. Now, they look like a Brian Froud stick insect fairy. Now, I was already aware of Froud's work, so was I predisposed to see whatever entity this was in that way? I don't know. The second time I had an experience was through the use of psychedelic drugs, and I hope no one from the local constabulary is going to be sort of looking at your podcast and paying me a visit, but this was a long time ago, Anthony. And
of course, we don't advocate the taking of these substances because, absolutely, of course, they're illegal within the UK, but nevertheless, it's the experiential side of it.
Absolutely. So this was LSD when I was living in Somerset. I had an orchard out of the back of my garden, very high dose LSD, and basically, you know, as soon as you came up, they're crawling around on the trees. Now, there was a kind of what I would call telepathic contact with these beings, which again were Froud-like. Once again, am I also predisposed to see that? I don't know. But that lasted for about 5, 6, 7 minutes. And it profoundly changed my outlook, more than the West Kennet incident. When I came down from it, it was, this world isn't what I thought it was before. And, you know, if you're looking for a message, a meaning, maybe that's it. Maybe these entities are simply here to make us realize that this material world is not all. Here are some messages for you to take forward in your life. My third example is after I lost my eyesight in 2015, and very soon after, I developed what seems to be something called Charles Bonnet Syndrome. I'll very quickly read out the standard NHS description of Charles Bonnet syndrome. It's a condition sometimes termed visual release hallucinations experienced by people who are losing or have lost their sight. It involves seeing things which are not really there, having visual hallucinations. The hallucinations are most marked in low light when relaxing, and are often complicated scenes involving faces, children, cartoon characters, and wild animals. Well, I disagree profoundly that these things are not really there, because when you have Charles Bonnet syndrome, and this has happened to me over the last 4 years, almost on a weekly basis. Sometimes it go weeks without, but these beings which come into the peripheral of your eyesight, what's left of my eyesight in my right eye, are profoundly real. And once again, they take the form, usually in a slightly cartoonish way, of Brian Froud's fairies.
Wow.
Again. am I predisposed to see this? Is that what they really look like, or how they're just appearing to me? Now, at first, when this started to happen, as you can imagine, with the loss of my eyesight and the trauma that went with it, I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. I knew nothing about Charles Bonnet syndrome. It was only when I went to a psychiatrist who knew all about it and explained it to me. Oh, right, that's interesting. And from that point on, I've just seen it as an interesting experience, nothing to be frightened of. These characters, unlike many of the folkloric fairies, are never malevolent. The folkloric fairies can be malevolent bandits a lot of the time. People were terrified of them and they were to be avoided. There's a benign nature to these visuals. So, for instance, if I'm feeling particularly anxious or depressed, they will always be saying to me something along the lines of, "Don't worry, it'll be okay. Just relax. Things aren't so bad." That kind of thing, with with telepathic promptitude. That's how it happens. And of course, that's the other thing. Not all people with Charles Bonnet syndrome have audial voices. It will just be a visual thing. Only about 20%, I think, people with Charles Bonnet syndrome have the audio. And of course, as soon as that started to happen as well, before I went to see my psychiatrist and found out about it, you think, well, this is schizophrenia. I'm hearing voices. Not only just seeing things, I'm hearing voices. I soon satisfied myself that that's not the case, and that Charles Bonnet syndrome is, to me, it's become a useful adjunct to the other more esoteric way of seeing the universe. And it's been a great help to me, I have to say. Most people would be horrified if these things started turning up in their living room. But I see it as something which is to be embraced.
This is absolutely fascinating. It was one of the main reasons I wanted to get you on the show, was your experience of Charles Bonnet syndrome. Because, as you know, in the new book, I have a whole section on Charles Bonnet syndrome. And it's a phenomenon and a concept I've known about for many, many years. And my own mother experienced it profoundly a few years ago. I won't go in. I've mentioned it many times on the show. I won't point it out now. But what is amazing is to be interviewing a comparatively young individual who, because of sight loss, is actually experiencing this very phenomenon, and just how powerful it is. And it is amazing to hear you say that these are not hallucinations. These are entities, these are things that have independence of your own subconscious. Your subconscious is not creating them. It's as if your eyesight loss is somehow accommodating and making you see through the doors of perception in such a way to see the reality that adjuncts this reality in some way and breaks on through under certain circumstances. Now, some of the research that some of my associates have been working on, I think it's down at the University of Sussex, they've recently discovered that when you have altered states of consciousness, when you take entheogens and everything else as well, it switches elements of the brain off. It actually switches off what Henri Bergson and C.D. Broad would argue is the brain as an attenuator. The brain is there to take out information. And they actually now know the areas of the brain that switch off when somebody starts having DMT in raised converse hallucinations. And clearly what they're doing is they're switching off the things that stop us seeing these things. Because, of course, we couldn't function in this reality if we were seeing it as it really was. And as William Blake said, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we'd see reality as it really is, infinite.
Or Aldous Huxley's reducing valve. And
the reducing valve of Aldous Huxley, exactly. And I think this is where we're starting to move now in terms of perception studies, to take these on board. And we need to be listening to people like you who are experiencing it. I would imagine the most frustrating thing you have is knowing that these things are real, they happen, and you're seeing things out there just because I can't see them. I call it electromagnetic chauvinism, the idea that I believe that what I'm seeing is a literal one-to-one relationship with what external reality is. And of course, we know that as naive realism. Yes. Even the psychologists and the perceptual sort of studies will tell you it's naive realism. That's not how it is. But the vast majority of people literally and metaphorically see the universe as their brain presents it to them. And it's people like you that are opening the doors of perception. And it's people like you with your academic background, with your approach to it, that is so refreshingly powerful. And I think this is why your Dead But Dreaming website is so, so important. And I want people out there who are listening to this, get onto Neil's site, contribute to it, and listen to what he's actually saying, because this is profoundly, profoundly important. So we're coming to the end of the interview, and all I can say is I found that absolutely enthralling. I really, really enjoyed this interview. It's a great start. You're going to be a great act to follow for everybody else for 2020, because this is going to go down as a classic. Really, really classic, and particularly the last 15 or 20 minutes. And I'd love to have you back on again to go into more about Charles Bonnet Syndrome as well. But as always, we've run out of time. So please, please, again, reiterate where people can contact you. I've posted something on Instagram. I'm posting something on Facebook. So if people want to contact you to talk to you about their experiences and about your experiences, can you please let us know now?
That's the Dead But Dreaming website is the best place to go. It's deadbutdreaming.wordpress.com, or you can just search for Dead But Dreaming. It usually comes up at the top. And that has my email. You can contact me on the site, but it also has my email. So if anyone wants to contact me privately, they can do it. Okay,
and as a final point, your new book, Dead But Dreaming, is due out spring this year as well.
Yep, hopefully either April or May. It's slightly confusing to call the book the same as the website, but there'll be. It's not a fantasy adventure, but there will be fairies involved.
Wow, this sounds so exciting! I have to source a copy of both your novels, I think, because I'm really keen to read them, particularly because we'll then get you back when I've read them, maybe next year, because that will be really, really cool. So wonderful, Neil. Thank you so much for joining us. So, gentlemen, this is ladies and gentlemen, it's Dr. Neil Rushton. So all I can say is thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating interview. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Cheers.